They don't chase, but avoidants break the moment you leave. Let's talk about the person who made you feel like you were always one step behind in the relationship. You gave, they pulled away. You leaned in, they leaned back. So you started to think, maybe if I stop texting so much, maybe if I play it cool, they'll finally open up. But here's the truth. You were dealing with someone avoidant, and avoidants don't chase. Not because they don't care, but because they're afraid of needing anyone. They equate closeness with losing control. So when you come forward with vulnerability, they retreat. But here's the twist. They don't chase when you're there, but they break the moment you leave. Because leaving, truly leaving, is the one thing that shatters their illusion of control. Suddenly, your presence is no longer a given. Your love is no longer on tap. Your energy, which they used to take for granted, is gone. And the silence, it's louder than anything you ever said. That's when avoidants feel the impact. Not when you send one less text, not when you take an hour longer to reply, but when you take your heart off the table. See, emotional distance never wakes someone up. Your absence does. So here's your power. You don't have to manipulate. You don't have to play games. You don't have to punish them with coldness. You just have to stop chasing. Not because it'll make them come back, but because you've remembered your own worth. And someone who needs distance more than connection doesn't deserve your front row seat. If they break after you leave, that's their moment to grow. It's not your moment to go back. Avoidants often withdraw not out of malice, but from a fear of emotional closeness. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of attachment dynamics. When someone appears distant, cold, or uninterested, it's easy to assume they simply don't care. But often, the behavior is a shield, an emotional armor built over time through experiences that taught them vulnerability isn't safe. For someone with avoidant tendencies, intimacy triggers alarm bells. It represents a potential loss of control, a threat to independence, or even a reminder of wounds they never healed. So when things begin to deepen, when emotions start to rise, they don't lean in, they pull away. It doesn't mean they don't feel. In fact, avoidants often feel deeply, but they've learned to detach from those feelings to avoid the anxiety they cause. The more they care, the more threatened they become by the vulnerability of caring. Love, for them, isn't just a beautiful experience, it's a risk. And because of this, they often keep people at arm's length, maintaining a level of emotional distance that protects them from discomfort, but also prevents genuine connection. This withdrawal isn't calculated or manipulative. It's reflexive. It's their way of staying safe in a world that to them often feels emotionally overwhelming or even dangerous. So when you reach out, when you try to get closer, when you offer them emotional intimacy, what you perceive as love and connection, they may interpret as pressure or invasion. Their instinct isn't to open up. It's to retreat, because they believe that needing someone or depending on someone could lead to pain, rejection, or disappointment. Often, avoidants learned early on that emotional self. Reliance was the key to survival. Maybe they grew up in environments where their feelings weren't validated or where emotional needs were ignored or punished, so they stopped expecting closeness to be safe. As adults, this shows up in subtle ways: hesitation to define the relationship, an aversion to deep conversations, or even a charming, magnetic exterior that deflects any real vulnerability underneath. It can be incredibly frustrating to love someone like this. You might feel like no matter how gently you approach, no matter how much patience you show, they never really let you in. You start to question your worth, thinking, if I were just different, quieter, cooler, less intense, maybe they'd open up. But their avoidance isn't about your value. It's about their fear. Fear of needing someone, fear of being seen, fear of being hurt. Understanding this doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does reframe it. It helps you see that what feels like rejection is often just self-protection. And once you know that you're faced with a choice, not of how to fix them, but of whether staying is fair to you. Because while avoidance may not act with malice, the impact on your heart can still be just as real. They rarely respond to emotional pursuit, but are impacted deeply when you truly walk away. For many people in relationships with avoidant partners, the instinct is to try harder when faced with distance. You sense them pulling back, and naturally, you lean in. You send the extra text, plan something meaningful, or try to have a vulnerable conversation in hopes that it will bring closeness back. But this often has the opposite effect. The more you pursue, the more they feel pressure. To an avoidant, even genuine expressions of love can feel suffocating if they interpret them as demands for intimacy or commitment they're not ready to give. This creates a frustrating dynamic. You're reaching out because you care, because you want to connect, but they experience that connection as something to manage or escape. So you're left confused, hurt, wondering why love isn't enough to bring them closer. You might even think that if you can just be a little more patient, a little more understanding, they'll eventually come around. But emotional pursuit rarely shifts an avoidant person. They aren't drawn to closeness by being chased. They're drawn to safety and space. Ironically, it's not until you stop chasing, when you genuinely detach emotionally and energetically, that something begins to shift in them. This doesn't mean pulling away as a tactic or pretending not to care. It means reaching a point where you're no longer willing to invest in a connection that consistently leaves you feeling undervalued or alone. It's in that moment, when your attention and presence are no longer guaranteed, that the avoidant starts to feel the weight of your absence. Avoidants often struggle with delayed emotional processing. When you're there, they're focused on maintaining distance. But when you're gone, when you've stepped back in a real, final, feeling way, the loss becomes undeniable. Your absence isn't just quiet, it's confronting. It reveals what they've pushed away. And for the first time, they may feel what they've been avoiding: regret, longing, or even the recognition that they did care more than they admitted, even to themselves. This isn't about using absence as manipulation. It's about honoring your boundaries and realizing that constantly chasing someone who resists connection is emotionally depleting. Your withdrawal is not an act of punishment, but an act of self-preservation. And in that space, when you're no longer trying to hold the relationship together by yourself, the avoidant is left to face the impact of what they've lost. It's often the only thing that truly reaches them. Withdrawing your energy completely, not playing games, is what creates the real shift. In many relationships, especially those involving someone with avoidant tendencies, people often turn to strategies and subtle manipulation to try to spark a reaction. Delayed replies, withheld affection, cryptic social media posts, all designed to make the avoidant person feel something to create just enough distance to make them come back. But these tactics rarely produce lasting change. Why? Because they're still rooted in chasing. Even when you're playing it cool, your focus is still on how they'll respond. You haven't actually let go, you're just trying to get a reaction in disguise. The truth is, people can feel the difference between emotional detachment and strategic silence. An avoidant can tell when you're pulling away to punish them versus when you're truly done overextending yourself. And it's that real, unperformed withdrawal, when your focus returns to your own peace instead of their potential, that shifts the dynamic in a way they can't ignore. Because for perhaps the first time, your attention is no longer orbiting around them. This kind of withdrawal isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with a long speech or emotional exit. It's quiet, calm, grounded in a place of self-respect. You no longer chase, not because you're trying to prove a point, but because you finally understand that the dynamic is costing you your emotional balance. You've stopped monitoring their every move, stopped looking for breadcrumbs of connection, stopped bending yourself to make them feel safe while you slowly lose yourself. That's not love. That's emotional labor you shouldn't have to do alone. And when that energy is no longer present, when the phone doesn't ring, the check in stop, the emotional availability dries up. They notice. Not because you're trying to make them notice, but because your absence is no longer negotiable. It's not a tactic, it's the truth. You've returned to yourself, And that energetic vacuum, the place you used to fill with reassurance, warmth, effort, is suddenly wide open. It forces them to confront a new reality. You're not waiting anymore. People with avoidant attachment aren't wired to chase, but they are sensitive to the emotional balance of a relationship. When they sense you've emotionally checked out, when there's no longer someone managing the connection on their behalf, they're left alone with the silence. That's when things begin to stir, maybe regret, maybe fear, maybe clarity. But whatever it is, it's real. And it only surfaces when the performance ends and the detachment is authentic. The key isn't to hurt them with distance. It's to stop hurting yourself by staying engaged in a dynamic that leaves you feeling unseen. This doesn't require anger or resentment. It just requires truth. When you withdraw from the cycle, not to provoke, but to preserve, you shift the energy of the entire relationship, not because you want them to come back, but because you're no longer afraid to walk away. And sometimes that quiet decision is what finally speaks the loudest. You gain your power back not by waiting to be chased, but by honoring your own emotional needs. When you're involved with someone who constantly pulls away, it's easy to slip into the mindset of waiting. Waiting for them to come around, waiting for them to reach out, waiting for the moment when they'll finally recognize what you've been giving and offer something back. But this kind of waiting quietly chips away at your self-worth. It puts your emotional well-being in someone else's hands and conditions you to believe that love is something you must earn through patience, silence, or shrinking your needs. The truth is, no one gains power by staying in a holding pattern. Real power comes from clarity. Clarity about what you need. Clarity about how you deserve to be treated. Clarity about when something no longer feels emotionally safe. And it's when you begin acting from that clarity, not from fear or fantasy, that everything changes. Honoring your needs doesn't mean making demands or issuing ultimatums. It simply means tuning into yourself and being willing to walk away from anything that consistently neglects the care, consistency, and emotional safety that love is supposed to provide. So many people confuse emotional strength with being low maintenance, easygoing, or endlessly forgiving. But true emotional strength is having the courage to say, this isn't enough for me. Even when you still love the person, it's recognizing when you're the only one reaching out, the only one making space, and deciding that your heart is too valuable to keep offering where it's not being met. Avoidants often won't push you away loudly. Instead, they create a quiet gap between you and them. A gap you'll feel tempted to fill. But you don't have to. That gap is theirs to close, not yours to endlessly cross. By shifting your focus from being chosen to choosing yourself, you start reclaiming the energy you've spent trying to keep the connection alive. You stop measuring your worth by how someone responds to you and start asking whether the relationship meets your emotional standards. And that's when your power returns. Not when they text you, not when they finally open up, but when you stop looking at their behavior as a mirror for your value and start using your own emotional compass to guide your next steps. That act alone changes everything. It reminds you that love isn't about proving you're enough. It's about being with someone who sees that you already are. Their breakdown after your exit is not a cue to return, but a sign that your absence finally spoke the truth. When you leave someone who has consistently resisted connection, it's not unusual to see a sudden shift in their behavior. The same person who once seemed cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable might suddenly show emotion, reach out, or even express things they never could while you were still there. It can be shocking, even confusing. After all the times you tried to get through to them, now, after you've walked away, they seem to care. They might say they miss you, that they're scared, that they didn't realize what they had. But this moment is not a romantic turning point. It's a mirror. It reflects what your presence and your love meant all along, even if they didn't know how to receive it. The breakdown you're witnessing isn't necessarily a breakthrough. It's often the delayed response of someone who spent so long avoiding emotion that they could only face it once it was too late. And while it might feel validating, maybe even tempting, it's important to recognize what's really happening beneath the surface. Avoidants tend to suppress their feelings until the loss becomes undeniable. They protect themselves from vulnerability by keeping their distance, maintaining control, and avoiding emotional risks. But when you truly leave, not as a performance, but from a place of peace and finality, the security they once felt begins to unravel. Suddenly, the emotional labor you provided, the stability, the availability, it's gone. And only then do they begin to realize how much they were leaning on what you were quietly giving. Yet that moment isn't a green light to go back. Their pain now does not erase the pain they caused when you stayed. The emotional neglect, the confusion, the endless cycles of hope and disappointment, that's the reality you lived. And while their reaction may feel sincere, it doesn't guarantee that they've grown enough to meet you where you need to be. Growth takes time, reflection, and consistent change, not just regret. Returning simply because they're finally feeling what you felt all along only reopens the wound you worked so hard to close. Your departure was your truth. It was your boundary, your act of self-respect. Your way of saying, I matter too. Their reaction to that is theirs to process. Your responsibility is to keep moving forward, not because you don't care, but because you finally decided to care about yourself just as much. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept, that sometimes love isn't enough to keep a relationship going. Not because your love was flawed or because you didn't try hard enough, but because connection can't survive when only one person is holding the thread. If you've spent your time trying to make someone stay, trying to prove your worth to a person who keeps their heart behind a locked door, let this be your reminder. You don't have to convince someone to care. The right connection won't feel like a constant negotiation. It will feel like coming home. You were never too much. You were just with someone who couldn't receive what you had to give. So when they break after you leave, remember, it's not your responsibility to fix what they ignored. You don't go back to prove a point. You move forward because you've already made one. Thank you for listening today, for showing up not just for this conversation, but for yourself. If this spoke to something you've been carrying, take it as your sign that it's okay to let go of what hurts and walk toward what heals. Take care of your heart. It's never asking for too much. It's asking for the right person to meet it. Goodbye for now, and thank you for giving me a moment of your time and your trust.